In the 1992 movie Sneakers, Robert Redford's character Marty Bishop learns that perhaps not all that is lost should be found. Anybody seen Sneakers? Yes. All right. The film follows Redford, who runs a company dedicated to revealing the weaknesses in other companies' security systems. To do this, he employs a who's who of high-tech specialists who are actually hackers with criminal backgrounds. The all-star cast includes Sidney Poitier, River Phoenix, Dan Aykroyd, Timothy Busfield, and James Earl Jones. When a new client shows up seeking their services to retrieve a particularly important item, the team finds itself embroiled in a high-stakes international standoff that brings Redford's sordid past back to haunt him. All is not as it seems to be as the group races to locate the valuable device and return it to its true owners if they could only figure out who that is. And I am telling you all of this because it's just a delightful movie that takes you back to the early days of computing and the ethical questions of that new technology at the time. And I thought maybe if you didn't have anything to do this afternoon after you go to fellowship and youth donuts and deacons and the mission study discussion, you might need a good recommendation of what to do with a few hours. But I also mention it because there's this great scene right in the middle of the movie that I'd like you to think about with me, because I think that it helps give us a little insight to this whole spiritual listening thing we've been thinking about together these past few weeks. So right in the middle of the movie, and those of you who have seen it will know, but I'll try my best to bring others along on the journey. Right in the middle of the movie, Robert Redford's character, Marty Bishop, gets kidnapped by some henchmen from one of the many groups that is vying for this device that's at the center of the plot. And he gets put in the trunk of a car and driven all around the city only to obfuscate their final destination. And ultimately he arrives at the central headquarters of the movie's antagonist, played expertly by Ben Kingsley. And they try to make a deal, but it kind of falls apart, and so the henchmen rough him up a little bit, they put him back in the trunk, and they drive him away, and they dump him somewhere in the city. This is all happening in San Francisco. And so he makes his way back to the team, and they try to figure out what they're going to do. And they realize that whatever they're going to do, they need to figure out where this antagonist's lair is. But how would they figure that out? The only person who's ever been there was in the trunk of a car when he went there. It's at this point that Whistler, the communications expert on the team, who also happens to be a blind, says, "What did it sound like?" In the car trunk, he means, what did it sound like? And at first, Redford can't really think of it. Like, it sounded like being in the trunk of a car, and I had some other things on my mind. I don't know what it sounded like. But the character Whistler pushes and pushes. What did it sound like? What did it sound like? What did the road sound like? Slowly, Redford begins to recall just a few small details. He remembers the low tone of the hum of the pavement. A highway, perhaps. He remembers that at one point there was a long stretch where there was a recurring sound. Thunk, 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 thunk. Seams in the concrete, Whistler quickly identifies. So you went over a bridge. Did you hear a foghorn? No, Redford says. So it wasn't one of the bridges that was fogged in last night, they concluded. Redford remembers some rough bumps, just a few, right at the end. They're railroad tracks, Whistler declares. And it goes on and on and on like that, and in this way, they find their way right to where they want to go. And the movie goes on. I really love to tell you what happens in the end, but I want you to watch it if you haven't. It's so great. But I've been thinking a lot about this scene since we started this series on listening. In part, of course, because it is about our hearing sense and how we use that, but often because this is often what I have found that listening to God, or trying to listen to God, sometimes feels like.
Is God speaking to me in my life? Certainly I've experienced some seasons where I felt confident that was the case. But I have known many other seasons when on the surface God has not seemed particularly communicative. No trumpets or angel visitations or miraculous alignments of wonderful opportunities. I've known many seasons in my own life where despite my diligent attention to prayer and reflection, I didn't have a sense of where I was going with God. And in those seasons, if someone had asked me, what is God saying to you right now? I might have said, echoing Robert Redford, well, how would I know? But what I've come to understand more recently as I've focused more in my own life on contemplative practice and reflection is that God's communication is not always what we think it is. Sometimes it's much more subtle than the prophetic proclamations in the Bible make it out to be. Sometimes it is only through careful attention to the various textures in our lives that we get a sense of where the Spirit is at work. I think about Elijah. He's just such a rich biblical character, right? How much do we admire is the passion with which he follows his calling to share God's word. I see so much to admire in him. And I also see some things in him that I also see in myself, including a flair for the dramatic. I don't know if you picked that up while Nancy was reading. I feel it, Elijah. I feel it. Now, Elijah's story, of course, takes place during the era of the kings, the period of the Israelite monarchy that was kicked off by King David. Elijah's sovereign is King Ahab, universally known as one of the bad apples among all these kings. He profaned the temple and enriched himself to the people's detriment. And as a prophet of God in that time, Elijah had gone head to head with all those evil impulses. He spoke boldly to the king. He tended confidently to the widow who was in need. He preached God's word wherever it was most needed. But as with all endeavors that involved poking the proverbial bear, his work attracted some negative attention from the people that were in power at that time. And in a moment of particular discouragement, when King Ahab's wife Jezebel was hot on Elijah's heels with violent intentions, Elijah falters. He goes out into the desert and he lays down under a tree, and here's where the dramatic part comes in. He says, you know what? I'm done with all this. I'm done with all of it. I'm done with the prophet stuff. I'm done with the God stuff. I'm done with this life. And he lays down under that tree and he falls asleep. And the angels come and they wake him up and they give him something to eat, and he goes back to sleep. This is a great model for self-care, by the way, right? Retreat, rest, refuel. Just so you know. And then the angels, they're so nice. They wake him up again. They say, here's some more bread. We've just freshly cooked it for you. And he says, thanks, and he sleeps some more. And then he wakes up and God says, hey, come over here. Let's have a little talk. So Elijah goes on this journey over to Mount Horeb, and God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah says, well, what am I doing here? I'm trying to do what you asked me to do, and I was doing a great job until you let all those goons come after me and try to kill me. And God says, okay, come, stand over here for a minute. Let's have a little talk. I'm about to reveal my essence to you. And there's this whole bit about the wind and the earthquake and the fire and God not being in those, and then the sound of silence or a still small voice, however you want to translate that, you Hebrew scholars. And interestingly, although we always think it doesn't actually say that God was in the silence either. What it does imply is that it's the silence which summons Elijah to the mouth of the cave so he can hear God speak. It's the silence that is the conduit to Elijah's listening to what God has to say. And to think about that, it occurs to me that Elijah's discouragement was very real. The threats to him were very real. His sadness was very real. Those observable realities deserve to be tended to, and they are, by God's messengers. But in this story, they're not the only things that Elijah can choose to pay attention to. Like Whistler's question to Robert Redford, what did it sound like in this moment? Elijah is invited, even in this really difficult time, to broaden his sensibility, to go a bit deeper than the surface realities of the moment, real as they are, and to tune in to these other textures around him in his life, in his ministry, in the world that are very subtle but present and powerful. It's notable that while Elijah is being chased by these like super violent forces, God shows up and puts on this like meteorological light show. Did you hear that? He's like breaking rocks and lighting things on fire. And the natural question is, am I in these things, Elijah? Do you think, am I in these things? And when Elijah is really listening, when he's really tuning into his heart, he has to say, no, God is not in all that. God is not with the powerful and the destructive things. Rather, God is in the silence. God is ready to speak somewhere in the quiet and to be with Elijah in the quiet of his uncertainty and despair, and also in his nascent hope and renewal. So what does this mean for all of us who are practical people? I can appreciate that, but what are we going to do about it? First, I think it means that the more time we spend in silence, the clearer sense we have of God's presence with us, period, end of story. Our contemplative siblings, the desert parents, the monastics, they've been telling us this for about 1,000 years. The more trouble you're in, the more turmoil you feel, the more silence you need. Despite the fact that we're all taught that prayer is just like kind of a pen pal letter to God, right? Dear God, here's some stuff that's going on. Please send help, provision, friendship. Hope all's going well, Liz, right? I think we sort of all got taught that model. Actually, it's silence and listening that are critical components of our prayer life too. And learning those disciplines is a practical thing we can do to amplify our awareness of the sacred within us. So there's one thing. But beyond that, I think, is this invitation to be listening to more than what is obvious, more than what is said. To feel into the different textures of your life when you seek to find God's quiet voice speaking. I know a lot of us have big things going on right now in our lives. Some of us need healing and we can't find it. Some of us need rest and it's not coming, or we feel stuck and don't know the way out, or we feel despair and we can't manage it. And all that is real. It deserves to be tended to, and God knows that it deserves to be named and tended to. But I think the sacred invitation that we hear in this text and in this series and broadly in our tradition is to explore beyond those things. Is to acknowledge that while we know all those things are true, there is also more that we know. There is a deeper knowing. A knowing that lies within. A knowing that affirms that no matter what maelstrom goes on the outside, we can know on the inside that we are beloved and that we are not alone and that we are upheld always in every moment of every day by the one who holds the entire world in his hands. And so my only question for you then, I guess, is what does that sound like for you in your life? What does it feel like? What is the texture of it? Of God's profound presence with and within you? What senses are you relying upon to decide what God is saying to you, and are there more you might employ? Where are the places or people or contexts in which you can sense that deeper calling, in which you can sense the truth of those things? What are you doing here? I offer those invitations. I think they're the ones that God offers to us, and I offer this continued conversation, asking that God might bless it and us together, and offer these in the name of the one who created, redeemed, and sustained us always. Amen.